great crowd for Amy Goodman and the Energy Fair. This is awesome. Yeah, so my name is Grace, and I have the pleasure of serving on the board with Ed of the MREA. It's an awesome board, and what a great thing to be part of. And I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Amy Goodman. All right. So a lot of you, it sounds like, know who Amy is, but I think that we need to, take a moment to think about all of her great accomplishments over her career. So Amy, as you probably know, is an award-winning investigative journalist, author, syndicated columnist, and the host and producer of Democracy Now! All right. Amy is the first journalist to win the Right Livelihood Award, widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. She's also won the Robert F. Kennedy Prize for International Reporting and the Alfred DuPont Columbia Award for her reporting in East Timor and Nigeria. Amy has additionally co-authored 5 New York Times bestsellers telling stories covering injustices and everyday heroes. And one of those books, her most recent one, that she wrote, you can purchase here today, and she's also going to be signing it after the talk. It's called The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprisings, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope. So get your book here. As Amy's reporting reminds us, when we talk about alternative energy, we're not just talking about solar installations and wind turbines. We're also talking about sacred indigenous lands threatened by the Keystone Pipeline in Canada. We're talking about global harm caused by expansive oil drilling and melting ice in Alaska. And we're talking about radiation sickness caused by nuclear disasters in Fukushima. So not to bring you all down, but Amy has done an extraordinary job, I think, of delivering these stories and so many more that motivate all of us to come to the Energy Fair and learn how to live more sustainably. So with that, the MREA is thrilled to award Amy with the Avenue of Advocates tree. So you can also find her tree somewhere out there. And if you want to join me in a warm welcome of Amy Goodman.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wait. I got to get a picture of all you beautiful people. Very nice. Wow, it's wonderful to be here. I did not expect New York traffic jam traffic on the way from the airport from Milwaukee here. It was actually worse than New York. Anyone else experience that? I think 2 roads went into one. Why, it's clearly would have been better to ride my bicycle, which I've always thought anyway. I also want to thank my chief navigator and co-author of The Silenced Majority, Dennis Moynihan, who picked me up at the airport and is a chief organizer for Democracy Now! And who will be signing the book with me afterwards. And no matter whether you get a book or not, I really do hope that you come up and say hi, suggest stories. Oh, and anytime you do have a story suggestion over time, to write to stories@democracynow.org with ideas, with people's names, numbers, email addresses. Democracy Now! Is a grassroots global news hour. And we come out of Pacifica Radio, which was founded, back in 1949, after World War II in Berkeley, California. Founded by a war resistor named Lou Hill. When he came out of the detention camps, he said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. As George Gerbner, founder of the Cultural Environment Movement, the former dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica was born. KPFA in Berkeley in 49, KPFK in Los Angeles in 59, my station in New York, WBAI in 1960. In 1977, the youngest of the 5 Pacifica stations, WPFW, in the power capital of the world. And before that, in 1970, KPFT in Houston. Now, KPFT in the Petro Metro of Houston. It's an unusual station. It's the only one in the country whose transmitter was blown up. That's right. It was 1970, in the spring of 1970, when KPFT went on the air. They were playing Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant when they blew the transmitter to smithereens. Now, KPFT got back on their feet. They rebuilt the transmitter. They started transmitting again a few months later. And the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the transmitter and blew it up again. So, a few months later, they got back on their feet again. If everyone wants to come on in, if it's raining, feel free. And there's lots of room on the stage or to sit here in the front. So, come into this sanctuary of dissent. Which I think the whole Midwest Renewable Energy Fair is, by the way. And we know we will have arrived when the Midwest Energy Fair becomes the Mideast Energy Fair. All about renewable energy. And then we will have accomplished peace on earth, for sure. But KPFT finally goes back on the air after being blown up twice. I think it was PBS that broadcast the moment when KPFT went back on the air, and Arlo Guthrie came into Houston to finish Alice's Restaurant. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act to blow up KPFT. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. For example, WORT in Madison, how dangerous WORT is. Why? Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's a 5-year-old boy in Charleston, South Carolina, who played dead so that he would not be killed, along with all the people who attended the Bible study on Wednesday night in Mother Emanuel at Emanuel AME Church. When you hear people speaking from their own experience, that's what breaks down bigotry and stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. That's why the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. When you hear someone speaking, you might say, it sounds like my baby or my bubba, it sounds like my aunt, my uncle, my mother. I mean, how often do we agree with even our family members? It's not about agreement. It's about understanding where someone is coming from. It makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. And when you begin to understand where someone is coming from, that understanding is the beginning of peace. Yes, I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is wielded all too often as a weapon of war. And that's what we have to change. That's why we have to take back the media. By the way, my colleague Dennis and other volunteers are handing out the Democracy Now! Flyers that let you know all the places in Wisconsin that Democracy Now! Broadcasts. It's usually like just a quarter page, but there are a lot of places in the greater area that broadcast Democracy Now! You know, we started on 9 community radio stations in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting, 9 stations. We were moving along. A few more stations picked us up every year. And then the week of September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And it just so happens that that week we were beginning on one TV station in New York. They wanted to connect to us at the firehouse. It was a community media center, an old firehouse turned into downtown community television. I said, as long as it doesn't interfere with the sound, which is the heart of radio, being able to hear people speak. And they said, no, we will. And then remarkably, that day, which was election day in New York, and when the World Trade Center towers were taken down and so many people died, we were supposed to be broadcasting on the first TV station, Manhattan Neighborhood Network in New York City. We began as emergency broadcasting, the closest national broadcast to ground zero. And soon TV stations around the country were asking, can we run Democracy Now! And then when we would run on television, on public access, the community radio station would ask, oh, we hadn't heard about Democracy Now! Before. Can we run Democracy Now! And then the Pacifica stations, well, they all were. And then the NPR stations started to broadcast us all over. And then the PBS stations, one after another, started to say, can we broadcast Democracy Now! Every day? Now in California, in San Francisco, KQED and KRCB, the 2 PBS stations, 2 public television stations in Los Angeles. And this is the case in Washington, D.C., on Howard University, the historically black college's PBS station, all over the country. And next February, we celebrate our 20th anniversary, and we're broadcasting well over 1,300 public television and radio stations all over the country and around the world. Maybe, who knows, maybe, just maybe, when we hit 20, in February of 2016, we'll be broadcasting on Wisconsin Public Radio and Wisconsin Public Television as well. But these are such painful times. Last night I was with Bill Moyers, Reverend, yes, you should applaud for Bill Moyers. The Reverend William Barber, the head of the NAACP in North Carolina, who's been running Moral Mondays for the past however many years that have now led to thousands of people protesting, sometimes tens of thousands over the years, the direction their state legislature is going. Also, Marian Wright Edelman, who founded the Children's Defense Fund. They were all being given a major award by the Drum Major Institute, and they all spoke, and they were awarded this by Martin Luther King III. So I was with all of them last night, and Reverend Barber said, on Wednesday night, he said, we were in jail after another protest, protesting for Medicaid expansion and women's rights, for voting rights, and all the issues they've come together around in North Carolina. And then the news flash came that in South Carolina, just down the road, at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, a young white man had walked in and joined a Bible study that was led by the Reverend and South Carolina State Senator, a truly remarkable man, Clemente Pinckney. I wish we had all known about him before last Wednesday night, so we could have heard him actually speaking as a living being rather than hearing him posthumously. I really do think as we build independent media, when we can hear all these voices, we will continue to be able to hear them. Because as I said, when you hear someone speaking, it makes it much less likely that you will want to destroy them. Reverend Pinckney and other worshipers gathered around a table for a Wednesday night prayer service and Bible study. He had actually raced from Columbia, South Carolina, where he was involved with a budget discussion, fighting for Medicaid expansion, health care, fighting for funding education, and of course some of the bigger fights in South Carolina. Also the fact that on their state capitol grounds flies the Confederate flag. Continues to fly the Confederate flag. And then when the young man named Dylan Storm Roth, if that's how you pronounce it, was found about 245 miles away in Shelby, North Carolina, driving down the road. You know, a florist, a woman, was driving, and they had gotten the word. The police put out the photograph and said to everyone, please look for this young man. I believe his father and uncle, when they saw the closed-circuit TV pictures at Mother Emanuel at the church that the police put out, they immediately told the authorities, he's ours. That's Dylan. And it was a florist who was on her way to work, and she saw the car that she had seen in the photographs that were spread around, and she thought, my God, I think this is the kid with the bowl cut. And she called her boss at the florist, and she drove off the road, but then she thought, wait a second, I'm going to drive back on, I'm going to try to follow him, and she followed him for 35 miles. As she was hooked into the police and to her boss at the florist, and she stayed even after the police stopped him to make sure that he was caught. This 21-year-old kid with Confederate plates on his car. Now his friends saying for months now, he's been saying he wanted to start a new civil war, to which last night Bill Moyers said, new? I think we can say the Civil War still rages on. And we have to accept that. Or as when we talk to the head of the NAACP in South Carolina, Dr. Lonnie Randolph said, we are talking the two states of South Carolina. Make no mistake about it, that flag that was negotiated to be no longer on top of the Capitol, but to fly on the Capitol lawn, is to many a swastika. That's what it symbolizes to them. The murder and deaths and enslavement of so many in this country. The issues that this brings together of racism in the South, as well as the issue of the number of guns that are freely available to people in the United States. President Obama's plea the next day said in anger, in frustration, said we have to recognize we are alone in the industrialized world and the most advanced countries in the world, and the levels of massacres that take place in this country, most often these young, white, alienated, white supremacist men finding some kind of identification. Why would he go to this church in Charleston? He wasn't even from Charleston. But what the black church has meant, why it has been such a threat to those who have a white supremacist ideology. It's where people take sanctuary, take refuge, where people draw strength. And it's not only African Americans, it's everyone. How important it is that we hear these voices. This young man who got a gun for his 21st birthday from his father, either gave him money for the gun or gave him the actual gun. You know, in the olden days, if kids who are alienated or mentally ill, and it doesn't just have to be kids, are angry or feeling frustrated, so they punch someone. That's the level of destruction. But the millions of guns that are available in this country, it takes it to an extremely different level. And why gun control is so important. President Obama dares to utter those words. And this isn't about hunters in the woods. This is about the hunting of innocent people in our country. How many times does it have to happen after Sandy Hook in Connecticut and the children gunned down? 90% of people in this country were for some sort of gun control. And yet the NRA prevailed. How does this organization have so much power? We have to take money out of politics, which is... You know, interesting as I come here to Wisconsin, you know, one of the original not very strong compromise bills was the McCain-Feingold bill, right? The whole issue of campaign finance and how money has corrupted the process. You know, it's interesting, Ireland, a few weeks ago, I was flying back from, I can't remember where, speaking in Cambridge University in England, and then I flew through on Memorial Day. I drove to London and to interview Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he's been holed up for 3 years. Then got on the plane, and they were showing this film called Pride, about gay and lesbian men, women who were fighting for minors' rights in Wales, and how economic rights and sexual equality all came together. And this was the weekend that Ireland voted for same-sex marriage. Absolutely astounding. And what isn't astounding, though, this Catholic country voting for same-sex marriage, if the politicians had been voting on this, I dare say the outcome would not have been the same. Although ultimately every party in Ireland did support it. But it's because it was put to a people's referendum. And then it's no longer about ideology. It's about who you sit next to, who you live next to, going to the butcher, the barber, a bakery. And that's what the people of Ireland celebrated, their own community. It wasn't about religion, or perhaps it was. The kind of religion that teaches us about humanity and compassion and love and embracing all. A huge tent for everyone. And I think that lesson, that the people's voices were heard, we can learn from right here in the United States. Yes, the corporations, these large moneyed interests, the oil barons like the Koch brothers, yes, they have tremendous power, but nothing like the power of a far greater force, and that is everyone collectively working together to making the world a better, safer, more loving place. Everyone's voice is being heard. I mean, Mother Emanuel, what they call the Emmanuel AME Church, is on Calhoun Street. It used to be called Border Street. It was the boundary between the city and the rural areas. But then it was changed to Calhoun, John Calhoun, Vice President, U.S. Senator, pro-slavery. The contradictions exist on every street, in every community, and not only in South Carolina. But what they have had to deal with. Reverend Barber said last night, now out of jail and in New York, receiving a major award for his spirit, for his fight for equality, was saying, oh, everyone across the political spectrum was saying we loved the tone of State Senator and Reverend Pinckney's voice. He said, but what about his words? What about his fight for equality in South Carolina that they have been battling for so long? This is the message we have to hear. And I dare say it represents most people. I really do think that. Dennis and I wrote this book of columns. We write a column every week. And this week, our column we wrote just before the massacre took place. But we put those columns together in a book, and we called it The Silenced Majority. Stories of uprisings, occupations, resistance, and hope. And we'll get to the Wisconsin uprising in a moment. But the silenced majority, right? I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who are deeply concerned about the growing inequality in this country, who are concerned about racial hatred and instead deeply care about racial harmony, those who are concerned about climate change, climate chaos, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. And this massacre of 9 people who ranged in age up to, 87. One man said his 90-year-old grandmother had just gotten the date wrong for this Bible study, or she would have been there too. But these precious people and these precious lives, that they were gunned down with a man explicitly saying to them, although he stayed for an hour, he sat next to the pastor. Where did he soak this in? It doesn't just come from him. How is it if he had told a number of friends he's got to get the blacks? How is it if he told a number of friends he wanted to start a new civil war? How is it, I assume, he said to others what he said to the people in this room, that you're taking over the world, you rape our women? He did not conjure this in his head. No, it doesn't resemble reality. But he soaked it in from somewhere. Why it matters what we all say. Why the climate in a country makes an enormous difference. Amazingly, he said to them, he almost thought of not doing it. He said to the police afterwards when he was taken, because these people were so nice, he said, for the hour. But he was on a mission. And he took the lives of all 9 people, a 5-year-old baby, child on the ground, pretended he was dead, and a woman who he called a racial epithet as he was walking out, still said to her, I'm not going to kill you because I want you to tell everyone else, right? He wanted to terrorize the rest of the population. What we experienced in this country this week was domestic terrorism. Out and out terrorism. And if we don't start labeling things what they are, You know, when the Dzhokhar brothers, the Tsarnaev brothers, Dzhokhar being the younger survivor who was just sentenced to death, when they blew up the Boston Marathon, they killed a third fewer. They killed, I think 3 people and mutilated many others. This is 3 times that number, immediately across the newspapers, and no one would object, right? Terror. Of course, it's the killing of innocent civilians. Terror. Why don't we see that when it comes to South Carolina? And we see the words massacre, but this is outright bloodthirsty terrorism because it was meant to send a message. And why does it matter? Why do these words matter? Because who do we label terrorists and who do we say are a little off, maybe mentally ill? This is what we have to look at. When we label only one group, Arab American or Muslim people, terrorists, but everyone else isolated lone wolves, we are not taking responsibility in our society in one case, and in the other case we are alienating and injuring whole populations. We have to re-examine what it is we do. Of course, this was domestic terrorism. Not only the killing of the people in the room, but trying to kill the spirit of the black church and terrorize a larger, peace-loving, multiracial community. And it was not only this young man's desire, it's where he came from, what he soaked in, what the group that he thought would make him a hero. Most people categorically reject this, of course, the violence, the hatred, and it is beautiful to see people across the political spectrum coming together. On Fox, we played on Democracy Now! Some of the comments. I mean, no one obviously was condoning this action, but they were saying this has nothing to do with race, it's about Christians. When the boy himself said, I am doing this to kill black people. And then the castigating of President Obama, right? Saying about President Obama, how dare he use this moment to get political, right? To call for gun control. When else do you do it? 14 times President Obama, since he has become President of the United States, to many of their, sadly, great chagrin, I mean the people that not only explicitly would support Dylan Roth, but those even that wouldn't. For example, well, one of the presidential candidates just announced from my city, Donald Trump, who was one of the leading birthers, saying, this man, President Obama, I need to see his birth certificate, he said, because how could this man, I dare say, purely racist, because he's saying, how could he be one of us? And listen to Trump's rhetoric, the horror, if people weren't giggling too much, when he talked about immigrants on the border. Right, he's talking about undocumented immigrants. You know, he was sued for hiring 200 Polish undocumented workers, but that's beside the point. Let's leave the facts outside the Trump palace as he's speaking. And he starts to talk about immigrants coming in from Mexico being the rapists. The hate that is spewed, that goes unchecked, each time hate is uttered, it must be challenged, especially in the media, because the media is the way we learn about everything unless we know directly our own experience. Maybe we come from another country, then we'll know about that country, but most people learn about the rest of the world through the media. And it's got to be through something other than a corporate lens. Last night, yesterday was June 19th. Juneteenth. Juneteenth is the day in Texas 150 years ago that the slaves of Texas, the enslaved Africans in Texas, learned about the Emancipation Proclamation that had been issued years before the day they were freed. It's both very sad, but also a time of jubilation that they were then freed in Texas. How far have we gone in 150 years? No, people are not enslaved in that way. We have made progress. But what traps people today? Poverty, the horror of poverty, not having access to equal education or opportunity, being trapped in communities near toxic plants, what we call environmental racism. All of these issues we have to look at and see as a whole. And that's what Marian Wright Edelman yesterday, the founder of the Children's Defense Fund, one of the leading civil rights workers during the civil rights era, was talking about. What traps people and holds people down today. But what makes us hopeful is the rebellions that are taking place and have been over these years. Let's look at the climate. And it is wonderful to see you all here today, not just saying no to a fossil-fueled economy, but saying yes. All of the wonderful alternatives that are being presented here at the fair should not just be alternative, they should be mainstream. And that's when we know we will be able to save the planet. What happened this week that ended up just being a news zipper every once in a while because of the horror of South Carolina? The Pope released his encyclical on the environment and climate change. In his long-awaited encyclical, Pope Francis has called for swift action to save the planet from environmental ruin, urging world leaders to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. He called for a change of lifestyle in rich countries steeped in a throwaway consumer culture and an end to obstructionist attitudes that sometimes put profit before the common good. Pope Francis said protecting the planet is a moral and ethical imperative for believers and non-believers alike that should supersede political and economic interests. A major theme of the encyclical is the disparity between rich and poor. He said, we fail to see that some are mired in desperate and degrading poverty with no way out, while others have not the faintest idea of what to do with their possessions, vainly showing off their supposed superiority and leaving behind them so much waste, which, if it were the case everywhere, would destroy the planet, he said. So we turn to Naomi Klein, great author and activist who wrote This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And we also talked to Nathan Schneider, who is a Catholic columnist with the Jesuit publication America, to talk about the significance of the Pope, who leads over 1 billion people on the planet and also has effect on much more, who will be coming to this country in the fall, in this election year, and addressing a joint session of the Congress. I wonder if they knew at the time when they invited him that he would be releasing this encyclical. It has been amazing to see the response of the Catholic presidential candidates like Jeb Bush, right? He converted over 2 decades ago. When asked about it, He said, I want to read it. But, I mean, first of all, he said, I love Pope Francis. He's an extraordinary leader. He speaks with such clarity. He speaks so differently, and he's drawing people back into the faith. All of which he said, I'm a converted Catholic now of 25 years. I think it's really cool. And he said, I hope I'm not going to get castigated for saying this by my priest back home, but I don't get economic policy from my bishops or my cardinals or from my pope. And who is another presidential candidate? There are many Republican presidential candidates to choose from this time, and I hope they all get up there and debate. I am for open and wide-ranging debates, and I expect that they should be not only when you go beyond the party debates, the Democrats and the Republicans, but that Green Party and other independent parties are included in the final presidential debates. I mean, a very pious Republican presidential candidate is Rick Santorum. When he was asked on Fox News by Chris Wallace what he thought about the Pope's views on the environment, that human beings have induced climate change, he said the Pope can talk about whatever he wants to talk about. I'm just saying that what should the Pope use his moral authority for? He said, I would say, and Chris Wallace said to him, well, he's saying he's protecting the earth. And Santorum said, I would say that's an important thing to do, but I think there are more pressing problems confronting the earth than climate change. And these candidates, they said, we should talk to the scientists. This is amazing to me. We're trying to get away from the Pope. By the way, you know the Pope was a scientist. You know that. But yes, I agree, we should talk to the scientists. If I say 95%, I am far underestimating the global scientific consensus on what is causing climate change. And why this is so important is to say that we can do something about it since we are causing it. But I want to quote some of what Nathan and Nermeen said, what Nathan and Naomi said. Nermeen was co-hosting that day, my wonderful colleague and co-host Nermeen Sheikh. But Naomi said, I think this encyclical, we can't overstate the importance of it, the impact it will have. It's hard to respond to a document that runs close to 200 pages when it was just released a few hours ago. She said it's like a gust of wind that's blowing through. And is now possible to say some very powerful truths about the real implications of climate change, the root causes. She said, a lot of the discussion about the encyclical in the US media has focused and will continue to focus on the impact on Republicans and on climate deniers, many of them Catholic. It's certainly a challenge to that demographic in the US because the Pope is coming out so clearly on the side of climate science and saying this is real, this is happening. But she said, I think it is too easy to say that this is just a challenge to Rick Santorum and Jeb Bush. Frankly, it's a challenge to Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and to large parts of the Green movement because, she said, it is a rebuke to slow action. It very specifically says climate denial is not just about denying the science, it's also about denying the urgency of the science. The document is very strong in condemning delays, half measures, so-called market solutions. It very specifically criticizes carbon markets, the carbon offsetting, as an inadequate measure that'll encourage speculation and rampant consumption. She said, I think probably the most significant part of it, the big picture, is the foregrounding of the culture of frenetic consumption in the wealthy world and among the wealthy. This is really significant because I think large parts of the climate change discussion tries to have it all ways and say, no, we'll have green growth. We'll consume green products. And this goes a lot deeper than that. No, we need to get at the underlying values that are feeding this culture of frenetic consumption that is entirely unsustainable. And so, responding to the Pope saying, in a corrupt culture, we cannot believe that laws will be enough to change behaviors that affect the environment. Naomi Klein said, yes, he's referring to corruption. I believe he's referring to the influence of polluting companies, of multinational corporations, which he also goes after in the encyclical. She said, I think this is one of the most significant things about the document. One might expect of a religious document about climate change to erase difference, right? To say, well, we're all in this together, and certainly it talks about the earth as our common home. But it also recognizes explicitly the power dynamics in capitalism, which is to say that there are forces within the system that are actively working against change. That is probably what he's referring to when he talks about how there may be laws, but the laws aren't enforced. Indeed, the laws are also inadequate, which is also addressed in the document. It has some very specific calls for another level of environmental law, which is a part of the document that is just being referenced now. She said, a lot of the language of the climate justice movement has been adopted by the Pope. She said, the phrases like ecological debt. The Pope is talking about the debt that the wealthy world owes to the poor. This is a framing that comes originally from Ecuador, from the movement against drilling in the Amazon. This is a phrase that was never heard in mainstream circles until just now. I've never seen such mainstream use of it, she said. So it's very important. But she said on a personal level, as thrilled as I am that the Vatican is leading in this way, this Pope is leading in this way, bringing together the fight against poverty with the fight to act on climate change, that doesn't mean there's a complete merger between the climate justice movement and the Vatican. Obviously, there are huge differences that remain over issues like marriage equality, reproductive rights, and freedom, just to name a few. She said that people have to come to this from your own backgrounds, but critically we can unite. And Nathan Schneider said, the Catholic columnist from the Jesuit publication America, this really is the first third world encyclical. It's coming from a Pope who was shaped in really significant ways by economic crises during the Cold War in Argentina, and being in the middle of a battleground between the first and second world powers. It was drafted by a cardinal from Ghana. So this is coming from the side of the world that we don't normally hear from. And it's very much in line with things that popes, he said, have been saying for a long time. But, he said, the emphasis, the language of climate debt, the recognition that there's a divide between rich countries and the poor, this is a cry from the developing world, from what has been labeled the third world, for change. Which brings me to the UN Climate Summit that's about to take place in December in Paris, France. This will be the binding one. If you're regular Democracy Now! Listeners or viewers, how many of you listen to Democracy Now! Excellent. How many of you watch Democracy Now! Fantastic. How many of you read the transcripts of Democracy Now! Great. I estimate we're in the range of 50, 60, 70%, and I am inspired by the 30% or 40 or 20% of you who've never heard about this before. You've just come to this fair. Maybe you heard there's great food here, but that's terrific. I hope that you'll tune to democracynow.org, find out where Democracy Now! Broadcasts in your area. You know, we're on WYOU in Madison, Public Access TV, and Milwaukee Community Television. We were just driving through Oshkosh very slowly, But we're in Oshkosh, WSCS Charter Channel 990, Stevens Point, UWSP TV Channel 10 every day at 1:30 in the afternoon, Sun Prairie, Superior Community TV, and beyond, Wisconsin Rapids, River Cities, Community Access Channel 3. And I just say that because these are the kinds of issues we take on every day. And if you're longtime viewers, listeners, or readers, you know every transcript, every day of every show, first show to do this, and first television radio show is one in this country. And we translate our headlines, by the way, in Spanish, and also work with an Uruguayan collective to voice the headlines in Spanish. So if you want to learn Spanish or you speak Spanish and you're trying to learn English, great way to put the English headlines together with the Spanish headlines. No better way to do it. But you know, if you're longtime viewers or listeners, we've been going to these UN climate summits from Copenhagen to Cancun, from Durban to Doha, from Warsaw to Lima. And we're going to Paris, the binding summit. And you will be hearing the voices of people all over the world who have been fighting for change around climate change. And if you're a longtime viewer or listener, you may remember this incredible moment when in Durban, South Africa, Anjali Apatarai, at the end of the UN summit, took to the stage. Now, you may wonder why we go every year, the whole Democracy Now! Team, for at least a week to cover these UN summits, thinking maybe they have accomplished nothing, which you might not be completely wrong in saying, why do we waste the fuel? Because of the people who come from all over the world, hundreds, thousands of people from the frontline states, from the deserts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that are sadly growing. The remarkable people of the Philippines, like Yabsanyo, who was just tweeting about the Pope's encyclical, who voiced this dire call year after year for the UN summits. He was the climate negotiator from the Philippines, and we were very surprised in Lima as he said, "This is the moment, our time has come." He wasn't in Lima. He'd been removed as the climate chief negotiator at the UN summit. Not clear if the United States had a role in that. He had become the lightning rod. He'd become the voice of the developing world around climate change. But we go because of the fascinating voices of the activists and the scientists who do not give up, even if the diplomats kind of have inside. And this was one of those moments. It was at the end of a long week. It was at the end of the summit. And Anjali Apatarai was invited to address the UN Climate Summit. Inside, not just outside. She was a student at College of the Atlantic in Maine, where you get a degree in human ecology. She brought in with her scores of young activists who lined the room as she stood up. She was invited into the inner sanctum. And the chairperson said, "I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Anjali Apatarai, who will speak on behalf of youth non-governmental organizations. You have the floor." And Anjali stood up. And this is a part of what she said. She said, "I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money. You have been negotiating all of my life. In that time, you failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before," she said. She said, "We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The world's poorest countries need funding for adaptation now." This was 2011.
She said, as 2012 dawns, our green climate fund remains empty. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. The most stark betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. She said there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. She said, stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. She said, respect the integral values of humanity, respect the future of your descendants. Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. So distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. And with that, she walked out of the room, followed by all the young people. And the next time I see Anjali, I will tell her that all of you at the Midwest Renewable Energy Fair all applauded her speech. It should be heard far and wide, and the chairperson heard it too. The chair of the UN Summit. And he said, thank you, Ms. Apatarai, who was speaking on behalf of half the world's population, I think she said at the beginning. And on a purely personal note, he said, I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last. So that sounds terrific, right? They got the message. The next year, I bumped into Anjali, but not inside. I said, I haven't seen you inside. And she said, oh, I've been banned. We have to honor and amplify the voices of the heretics, the dissidents, the prophets of our time. And we need a media that provides that sanctuary of dissent. It's the only thing that will save us. As I wrap up and look forward to talking with you individually, I wanted to end with a few stories. Where we go from here, we cannot erase history because really that is our inspiration. I think that's what that young man wanted to erase, is the history of struggle in this country and the fight for equality. You know it here in Wisconsin. In 2011, you were the model. Well, maybe we go back to the Arab Spring, right? You had Tunisia, where a young man comes out of university, has no opportunity, goes to sell fruit and vegetables at the local market, and the authorities take his stand. He can't take it any longer, take his scales, and he ultimately sets himself on fire, and he ignites the spirit of the people of Tunisia who overthrow their dictator. And this is the spark of the Egyptian revolution. Where that will go now remains to be seen. But at the time, it was astounding. And they overthrow the long-reigning despot Mubarak because 1 million people took to Tahrir Square and squares all over Egypt. And if you watch and listen to Democracy Now!, you heard our very brave Sharif Abdel Qaddous in Tahrir Square reporting the voices of the entire community rising up and what that meant. Oh, Sharif, bringing us, when the thugs took down the satellites, the networks brought us that bird's eye view, which was so impressive of Tahrir. But when they took down the satellites, you had suddenly the reporters. I remember seeing Anderson Cooper of CNN with a sort of old Skypey version saying, the lower third said, reporting from an undisclosed location in his hotel room, thinking, oh, this looks like the old Democracy Now! Where we would be out in the streets with that Skype. But Democracy Now! Was different in Tahrir. Even when the satellites were taken down, and at the beginning we used the very grassroots technology, but now we can use satellites, but we couldn't use that. But we're used to being scrappy. We pioneered a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet, and by the way, we have to keep the internet open and free so we can all communicate with each other. The corporations have been globalizing for years, corporate globalization. The internet provides a way for us all to communicate with each other, and we can't let the video companies and the telecoms write the legislation that would privatize the internet. And recently, we had an incredible victory at the FCC. Yes, they heard the millions of voices, of emails and calls to the FCC. No agency in our government has ever been responded to in this way. There is a hunger for communication, for the oxygen of a democracy. And so I was saying that we developed this way to send broadcast quality video through the internet, so we just went back to our old ways, and there was Sharif in the middle of Tahrir. As other reporters were saying, broadcasting from an undisclosed location, he would say his name, he'd say, I'm right here standing in the middle of Tahrir, the safest place to be right now. And he was with Hani Massoud, our great videographer, also Egyptian-American like Sharif, who was on like the Egyptian national basketball team. He leaps tall buildings in a single bound. When you're covering protests, you want Hani at your side. He couldn't be here now because his wife is just about to give birth. So I wish Hani and Aisha well. But Hani was there, and he would take the interviews that Sharif was doing, and you got to meet, as a result of them, all of these people. And he would run back to their house, and he would produce these 25-minute pieces and send them through the internet to New York, where we would broadcast, as the rest of the networks were showing the bird's eye view, these beautiful pieces crafted by Sharif and Hani. And you would meet Hadef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love. You would meet, Nawal Saadawi, at the time, 79-year-old. She had once been an Egyptian presidential candidate. Then she'd been imprisoned under Nasser, and she had been exiled under Mubarak. And she had been saying to the young people, even before the uprising, we will win, we will win. You got to meet the high school student, who I believe is in jail today. But then she was standing in front of the state media building, and she was giving out these broadsheets, these newspapers that said Voices of Tahrir, in the face of the state media building that had spewed lies for so long. This was the family, the community of Egypt that was saying no to despotism and yes to democracy. And you got to hear them as if they were your aunts and your nieces and your children and your uncles. Yes, that is the power of community media, and it is contagious. Which is why I think when Madison happened, you had people in Egypt sending orders through to local pizza parlors, right, to ensure that those who were sleeping in the capital were well fed. And that went on to Occupy in New York. There was so much food at Occupy in New York. They would have these big buffet lunches. And a lot of pizza is sent, I think, by Madison folks and people from Egypt and people from all over. The pizza parlors of that local community in downtown New York were doing very well. And you'd see these long lines of people. And, a lot of guys, this is the financial district in Occupy, right, Zuccotti Park. A lot of guys in three-piece suits, getting those, they heard there was a free lunch around the corner. Why not? But, if reaching you, if to reach you, what's the saying about reaching you through your stomach? I can't even think of it now. But let it be. So what happened here in Madison. We don't have to go so far to use examples. I mean, when we came into Madison over and over again, working with our colleagues at WORT, WORT, oh my goodness, 150,000 people in the freezing cold. I got to go up on one of those cranes. Usually I'm there to talk to people, but just to see the humanity. And I mean, when we first came in, we came to the Capitol, there were the largest guys I have ever seen, all tattooed, and I went over to them, and, well, I was just thinking about this, because I just came through Oshkosh, and no, I'm not kidding, and I said, what do you do? And they said, we're prison guards at Oshkosh. So I said, oh, what are you doing here? And I said, who did you vote for? And they said, well, Governor Walker, of course. So I said, so then what are you doing here? And they said, protesting Governor Walker, of course. And I was outside and people were freezing, and there was a man, older gentleman, white hair, glasses, he was marching with a sign, and I said, what's your name and what do you do? His sign said, IRS auditors against Walker. And I said, would you mind telling me what party you're in? He said, I'm a Republican. And I said, who'd you vote for? He said, Governor Walker. And I said, so what are you doing here? He said, he didn't tell us he was going to do this. And I mean, I think about Ireland today. It's about issues of humanity and decency and people overall, the goodness in people wanting to care about community, and they saw that being ripped apart. I mean, when I was in the Capitol, you know, I'm from New York, I don't see scenes like this. I was in front of the governor's office, and there were kids with dreads who were drumming, you know, on those drums, the plastic drums, and there were police officers rocking out next to them. And the police officers and the firefighters would say, but you're not threatened. Walker explicitly said you would not be targeted. And they said, but the nurses and the teachers are. And so, you know, we're married to them. And they would be sleeping next to them at night. And they also knew, as another one said, if they're going after the nurses and the teachers, we're next. But to see this uprising of humanity, and to look across and see the Labor Museum and learn about the history of Wisconsin, 1932, right? Isn't this where AFSCME was founded, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees? Of course, it's also where the Koch brothers the Koch brothers fathers organization was founded, right? The John Birch Society, Fred Koch and his allies. So there are many different strains in Wisconsin. But if you ever think for a moment it was a flash in the pan, think again. And Occupy as well, that this led to. Well, in between Wisconsin, that inspired so many people across the country, and Occupy, which was September 17th, 2011, right at the end of August and September, you had thousands of people surrounding the White House. Naomi Klein was there, Bill McKibben was there. You remember 1,200 people were arrested. It was Naomi's first arrest, protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. And this inspired that. And then those people came up to New York and were part of Zuccotti. And I remember at the time, 1,200 people arrested. And how many years later is this? Something like we're coming on 4 years later. No decision has been made on the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, that might frustrate many of you, but it was going to be made much earlier than this. And you can be sure there's a reason why the decision to approve it has not taken place. Grassroots activism has enormous power. Zuccotti and the Occupy movement all over this country, if you think for a moment it was simply eviscerated by that sort of coordinated police effort all over the country that wiped out the encampments, think again. Occupy occupied the language. All over this country and around the world, people know exactly what you mean when you say the 99%. People know what you mean when you say the 1%. And the 1% understands that you know. And I have to also say that there are many in the 1% who may very well agree with you. When you have this kind of economic disparity, it threatens everyone. It shakes the foundations of a democracy. This is an absolutely pivotal year that we are moving into, right? 2016 is a presidential election year. Let us not allow it to simply be a horse race where the networks, your eyes glaze over because it's about who's ahead, who's behind, who, the poll here, the poll there. It is up to you in every town hall, whether a politician is there or not. There is a window. They do have to pay attention for this moment. They have to come out of the back rooms making those quiet, secret deals and get your vote. It really does matter. And it's not just about what you do privately in the polling place. It's about what you say and how you organize beforehand. Which brings me to, that's looking forward. But let's, oh, no, not that. No. That's looking forward to 2016. But let's look back to the people who most inspire us. Someone like Rosa Parks, and so profound her lessons today. You might say, if we just have a few minutes, why talk about Rosa Parks? Because she's one person who everyone knows her story. But the media gets her story wrong. Right, you all know that on December 1st, 1955, you might not know the exact date, but you certainly know the act. She sits down on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to get up for a white passenger. She's arrested. 4 days later, she goes to, oh no, not before Joanne Robinson that night starts to mimeograph off thousands of flyers. She is a teacher and a fellow activist, and she starts to mimeograph flyers to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, to boycott the buses until they allow all people to sit together. And then December 5th, Rosa Parks goes to court, and the Montgomery Improvement Association has its meeting. And they choose as their leader to lead the bus boycott a young minister who's just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Yes, Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. Which brings me back right there to Madison, actually. Because 1932, the beginning of AFSCME, how did Martin Luther King die? It was April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. He'd gone to stand with sanitation workers for them to organize a local of AFSCME, 1707, to show how important what people's actions represent, no matter what year, whether it's 1968 or 2015. There is all a continuum. And so Dr. Martin Luther King in 1955, a young minister, is chosen to be the leader, and he leads the bus boycott for the next year, and it ultimately leads to the integration of the bus system of Montgomery. Rosa Parks did that. Now, when she died a few years ago, Democracy Now! Raced to Washington because before the big funeral in Detroit, her body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. First time an African-American woman had been honored in this way. And then she was brought to a big church in Washington. Thousands came, and we went to cover it. Oprah was inside. Cicely Tyson was inside. We were outside, where it's often more interesting to be. They'd set up loudspeakers, and they were projecting what was happening inside. And people had come from everywhere. We interviewed a college student. And I said, what are you doing here? A young African-American college student. She said, oh, I emailed my professors this morning. I said, I won't be in class. I'm going to get an education. And how did the media get it wrong in talking about the great Rosa Parks? Well, they paid tribute. They certainly paid attention when she died. They said Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. She knew. Yes, she was tired too, but she knew exactly what she was doing. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked with E.D. Nixon. He was the president. He came out of radical labor politics. He worked with A. Philip Randolph, the greatest organizer of the 20th century. He went on to organize the A. Philip Randolph, the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. But A. Philip Randolph, before that, organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the thousands of black conductors on the trains who were all called George, for George Pullman, who owned the trains. Their mothers didn't name them George. Showed you why they needed to organize. And E.D. Nixon worked with him. You know, A. Philip Randolph, Senator Barack Obama told this story in the backyard of a New Jersey home when he was campaigning first time around for president. He was speaking, and a guy at the back raised his hand, and he said, "What are you going to do about the Middle East?" And Barack Obama said, he told the story of A. Philip Randolph being brought to FDR by Eleanor Roosevelt, being brought to President Roosevelt. And he was brought to talk to him about the condition of black people, the condition of working people in the United States. As the story goes, FDR listened intently, said nothing. And then he said, "I don't disagree with anything you have said, but you're going to have to make me do it. Make me do it." And that's the story that Senator Obama told in the backyard when someone said, "What are you going to do about the Middle East?" And that is still the challenge to all of you about the Middle East and beyond. On every level, it's not just going to happen. It's because you fought for it. I don't know who said this, but I often think about this line. I think back on my life and think about all the times I thought I went too far and realize now I didn't go far enough. Think about that in this critical period, whether we're talking about racial and economic justice in this country or whether we're talking about climate change, the fate of the planet. So Rosa Parks was an activist. She trained at the Highlander Center. Dr. King went to the Highlander Center, black and white together, organizing to more strategically affect change. We had Pete Seeger in last year before he died, and he told the story of when he was perfecting "We Shall Overcome." He was singing it at the Highlander Center, getting all the words just right, and Dr. King came, and he's singing it to him, and Dr. King, when he drove away, he said to a person in the car, "Hey, that is a catchy tune." And it becomes the anthem of the civil rights movement. You know, all people working in every sphere of life, however you work, wherever you find your comfort zone, do it. Everything you can give. Think about what Rosa Parks did. Now, how the media got it wrong is they said she wasn't a troublemaker. They denigrate activists. And it's not just in the case of Rosa Parks. But what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? I mean, if you're involved in social change, you will help to build a foundation. Who knows when that magic moment will come? But if you have helped to build that foundation, you will be making history. You will be determining the future. And to show how remarkably brave Rosa Parks was, just go back a few months to the summer of 1955. That was the summer of Emmett Till. 14-year-old boy, African American, Chicago. You older folks might remember back then about what happened to Emmett. His mother, Mamie Till, wanted him out of the city for the summer, sent him to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins in Money, Mississippi. He was asleep one night with his cousins, and a white mob came. They ripped him out of bed. They said he had wolf whistled at a white woman. Wolf whistled. Emmett had a stutter, and his mother taught him, every time you feel a stutter coming on, whistle. He ended up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and sent to Chicago for the funeral, his mother, Mamie Till, did something incredibly courageous. She said that she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands passed by his casket and saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications actually took photographs of his distended, mutilated head. And they were published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? For just 1 week. And these wars, make no mistake about it, relate directly to what you're doing here today, trying to change the way we fuel our economy. I think of the joke of the little kid who says to his father, "What's our oil doing under their sand?" Talking about Iraq, right? If we saw the images of war that are fought, whether it's for oil or soon will be for water, if we saw those images of war, if we saw a baby dead on the ground and the front page of every surviving newspaper had a photograph of her and a story telling her story, telling us her parents and her siblings' names, if every new radio and TV newscast started with a story of a woman with her legs blown off in a drone strike in Yemen as she was attending a wedding party, and we learned who she was and who was getting married, if on everyone's Facebook wall, every tweet you sent, every email, you talked about a soldier dead and dying from wherever. Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. And I'll end back in World War II. I was just in Amsterdam coming from The Hague where 1,000 women gathered to say no to war once again with 4 Nobel Peace Laureates who were women reenacting what happened 100 years ago in World War I when 1,000 women gathered from around the world to do the same thing at The Hague. But I visited Anne Frank House, and once again it reminded me of another remarkable young woman and young man, Hans and Sophie Scholl. They were German. They were a sister and brother who, together with their professor and others, formed the White Rose Collective. They weren't Jewish. They were German Christians, but they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they decided to publish a series of pamphlets to get word out so the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And they published a series of 6 pamphlets, and across one of them were written the words, "We will not be silent." They distributed them everywhere. In the middle of the night, in an alley, in a courtyard, in a schoolyard, in a marketplace. But they were captured with their professor by the Nazis. They were charged, tried, convicted, and beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of journalists today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all. We shall not be silent. Democracy Now!